Okay, so let me begin. Are there questions from last time's lecture?
Sir? Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, when you were saying, last time when you were saying about exchanging two particles, mathematically what it would mean, like there's a, does it mean that there's a continuous transformation that exchanges two particles?
Well, the point is that if you have a function of two variables, for example, then you can ask what happens to the function if you just exchange the two variables, right? I mean, suppose you have psi r1, r2, you want to know how is it related to psi r2, r1.
Yeah.
But strictly speaking, this question makes sense if there is a continuous function, right? Otherwise, psi r1, r2 and psi r2, r1 are defined in two distinct spaces, right? If you cannot go from r1, r2 to r2, r1 by in a continuous fashion. So,
okay.
While the statement is about exchanging r1 and r2 in the argument of psi, unless this function psi is defined for that there is a single function that is defined for all r1 and r2, this question doesn't become doesn't have too much meaning. Okay, so in that sense, yes, so we do want a continuous function that takes you from r1, r2 to r2, r1. Okay. But strictly the statement is that if you exchange r1 and r2, the function should come back to its original value up to a sign. And if, for example, you have an abstraction, right? Suppose you have psi r1, r2, you define only for r1 larger than r2. Then for r1 less than r2, this happens in one dimension. Then for r1 less than r2, you can just define psi so that it's minus of r psi r2, r1. Right? Then by definition, you can make it antisymmetric.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Okay. So let me begin. So last time we studied quantum theory of multiple fermions, multiple identical fermions. And we saw that in analogy with bosonic case, okay, where the wave function is symmetric under the exchange of two positions. Okay. In the fermionic case, if you want to define the system of multiple fermions, okay, we can define it by a second quantum system, okay, which is defined by an operator algebra of this kind. Okay, so you introduce the creation and annihilation operators just like in harmonic oscillator. Okay. However, you postulate that instead of commutator between AM and AN vanishing, it's the anti-commutator between AM and AN vanish. Similarly, anti-commutator between AM dagger and AN dagger vanish. And the anti-commutator between AM and AN dagger becomes delta n. And the Hamiltonian has a similar structure. It's given by sum over n, En, AN dagger n. So now the question is there a quantum field theory from which we can derive this? Okay, just like in the case of bosonic particles, we saw that there is a third description as a quantum theory of fields. We can ask whether there is a similar description for fermions. And so for this, we will begin with the same classical system that we had for the system of identical bosons. So this part, whatever I have written here, is identical to what we had for bosons. So Lagrangian was given by this expression over here, from which you can derive the Schrodinger equation, IH by del psi del t equal to H hat psi, either by using Euler-Lagrange equation or by action principle. The conjugate momentum is defined by this functional derivative, which is here, and the Hamiltonian is also given in terms of the Lagrangian by this formula. And what I'll be doing from now on is to use the language of functional derivative all through. But in case you have doubts, you can always discretize this by writing as a sum over coordinates, and then think of these as ordinary derivatives with this extra 1 over WQ with the definition. But I'll be proceeding with this. So is this okay? Any question? Okay. So let me then start the quantization procedure. And as in the case of bosonic theory, we'll quantize by regarding the fields as operators. Okay, so we'll think of the psi and psi star as operators. This is of course a constant, but we'll just simply eliminate pi in terms of psi star as we have done. Okay, but if you want to do it more systematically, you can always work in terms of real coordinates. So we regard the fields as operators, and then we'll be using these relations. So what are these relations? These relations look very similar to what we had for in the bosonic theory, except that unlike in the usual case where you replace the Poisson bracket by commutator bracket or 1 over I h bar times commutator bracket, here I have written down these relations by replacing the Poisson bracket by 1 over I h bar times the anti-commutator bracket. So instead of saying that the commutator of psi and pi is given by this, I say that it's the anti-commutator between psi and pi that is given by this. Anti-commutator between psi and psi gives you 0, and the anti-commutator between pi and pi gives you 0. And the Hamiltonian has a similar expression. Okay, just make these operators. So psi now is an operator, psi star you have to replace by psi dagger. And the relation between pi and psi also is preserved, except that psi star again is replaced by psi dagger. And just as a reminder, let me tell you that AB anti-commutator is just AB plus BA. So this is the main difference between bosons and fermions. However, I should emphasize that this rule that I have used here is an ad hoc rule. Okay? This is not the regular rule that we use for quantizing a classical system. Because the rule for quantizing a classical system is always that we use commutators, and that will give you a system of identical bosons. So this is what I have said here, that this does not follow from the standard rules of quantizing a classical system. And because of this, there is really no classical limit of a fermionic field theory. In particular, correspondence principle, that is usually derived in quantum mechanics, does not hold, because that requires replacing the Poisson bracket by 1 over I h bar times commutator bracket. Okay? And this is not what we are doing. Are there questions?
So, but like we are still quantizing, not if I might be wrong saying this statement, but like we still have a classical Lagrangian, and we wrote this Hamiltonian, this fermionic field theory using this classical Lagrangian. So in the end, like we have in some way to like go from classical theory to quantum theory.
Yes, that is true. Okay. But this is not what I'm saying. This is not the quantum version of the classical theory. This is a rule that we are following.
Yeah.
Right? We wrote down a classical theory, and from there we said that this is what we do to quantize them as fermions. Okay. But this is not the standard procedure for quantizing a classical system. Right? Whether it's a field theory or a quantum mechanics, right? Normal procedure for quantizing a classical system is that you replace the Poisson bracket by 1 over I h bar times commutator bracket. And if you do that, then you can have derive the correspondence principle that for appropriate wave functions, the state behaves classically. That will not be the case here. So it is true that we have started with the classical Lagrangian and we are using that to derive these rules. But this is not the rule for deriving quantum mechanics from classical mechanics. Is that point clear? Okay, maybe in the next slide, it will become a little clearer what exactly it means, because in the next slide, I'll show the difference between bosons and fermions, right? What you can do for bosons that you cannot do for fermions. And in what sense, this is not the quantum version of a classical theory, namely that it doesn't have a classical limit. Normally, once you have a quantum theory, right, there is an appropriate limit in which it becomes classical. You can describe this by a classical theory. That doesn't happen for fermions. Because it is in this sense that this is not the quantum version of the classical theory that we started with.
Sir,
Yes.
is it partially because we do not have a classical version of an anti-commutator?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a classical version of an anti-commutator, right? This, for example, is symmetric under RI prime exchange, right? Whereas the Poisson bracket is antisymmetric under RI prime exchange.
Okay.
Okay, so let me try to be more specific, right? What we can do in bosonic theory that we cannot do for fermions. Okay. So if you take a bosonic theory, then there we can construct a quantum state that closely approximates a classical field configuration. Okay. So let's suppose that we have a classical field configuration at some time t equal to 0, where the field takes some value f of r. F of r is some given function. Somebody has given you f of r and asks us to construct a classical a quantum state that approximates that classical field configuration. And the way we can do this, we first decompose fr in the eigen functions of h hat. Okay, this is a useful, convenient tool, even though it's not strictly necessary. So let's decompose fr in the in the basis of eigen functions of h hat. So there is an expansion of this kind. These are just some constants, some numbers. And now we compare this with the expansion of the quantum field, right? We have seen that the quantum field for the bosonic theory has this structure. In fact, for fermions also it will have a similar expansion. Okay, but these ANs will now satisfy the anti-commutation relation. But anyway, let's stick to the bosons for now. So if we compare this to the quantum, to the expansion of the quantum field psi, we see that if we want to approximate a classical field configuration, right, that is described by this function f of r, what we need is a state, is a quantum state in which an behaves classically with value fn. So this is what I've said, an approximate classical field configuration will be described by a quantum state for which the expectation value of an is fn. That's clear. But what is more important is that the variances in various quantities should be small compared to their mean. So for example, an and an dagger don't commute, right? So clearly you cannot have a state which is an eigenstate of an and an dagger. However, what we need is that both an and an dagger will be sharply peaked around their some mean values, right? So if an has expectation value fn, an dagger should have expectation value fn star. But more importantly, the variance, right, the fluctuations of an and an dagger around their mean value should be small compared to the values themselves. So both the variance of an and an dagger should be small compared to fn. That's what I mean. That's what one means by classical state. And for free particles, you might have encountered such states. Right? If you take, for example, a Gaussian with an appropriate phase, then it's localized in position space. It's also localized in momentum space. And by choosing the phase appropriately, you can think of this as a Gaussian wave packet that's moving with some velocity v and centered around some position x naught. And of course, you cannot make the uncertainty, the variance of x and p or x and v, both arbitrarily small. They are limited by uncertainty principle. But as long as x naught and v are large, then you can make sure that the variances are small compared to the x naught and v. Okay, so the variance of x naught is small compared to x naught itself. Variance of x is small compared to x naught, and the variance of dx dt is small compared to v. This you can also do for harmonic oscillators, and in fact, the states that does that are known as coherent states. But just like in the case of free particles, okay, you need large position and large momentum to make the uncertainty small compared to the positions and momentum. Here, you need to excite large number of states. Okay, so if you want to construct a coherent state that has this property that an expectation value is fn, an dagger expectation value is fn star, and the variances of an and an dagger are small compared to fn, or the magnitude of fn, then this requires applying large numbers of an dagger on the ground state. Okay, that's what one calls coherent state. If you are not familiar with coherent state, you don't have to worry. But this is the important point, that you do need large number of an daggers on the ground state. And indeed, for the bosonic field theory, we can't do that because these are just normal harmonic oscillators. So you can apply large number of N daggers on the ground state. But a similar construction will fail for fermionic theory because you cannot apply N dagger more than once. And it is in this sense that there is no classical limit. That you cannot construct a classical state in this fermionic field theory in analogy with what we could do in the bosonic field. Are there questions on this?
So
Yes.
Applying large number of AN dagger on the ground state means that we have a lot of particles, like
Well,
in each state.
In the quantum field theory, yes, we have a lot of particles in each state.
And that we are saying in the classical limit is somewhat a field.
Exactly. So that, well, see, it's not just large number of N daggers, right? You have to take, to construct the state appropriately. It involves exponentials of N daggers and N, this coherent state. But indeed, so a classical field you can think of as being created by a large number of particles condensing. Okay, so what to think of as a classical electromagnetic field, for example, you can think of you can also regard this as a condensation of large number of photons, okay, which will turn out to a quantum electromagnetic field. And this is true for all fields. But in harmonic oscillator, it just means that you have to go to highly excited state, and which is understandable from the physical considerations, right? Because if you have low-lying states, right, then their position and momentum uncertainties are more or less the same order as their positions and momentum themselves. It's only when you have go to highly excited state, okay, which corresponds to particles oscillating with large amplitude, that you can have some resemblance of a classical state. Are there questions?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
So like we can still apply a N dagger with like different ends. In that sense, like we can create many particles.
That's not a coherent state. You can still create many particles, right? But as I said, just having, coherent state contains many particles, but not every many particle state is a coherent state, right? To construct
Yes.
you have to apply the same N dagger many times, and you have to do it for every N.
Yes, yes. But to have a classical limit, is coherent state necessary?
Yes, if you mean by coherent state something which has whose variances are small compared to the actual mean value,
Yes.
indeed it is necessary.
Okay.
So that you cannot do this. You can clearly see, right? Because you want each N to be centered around some Fn, right? So you can
Yes, yes.
problem for each N separately, right? That N expectation value should be Fn, and the variance of N should be small compared to Fn, right? And that is independent of what other oscillators you have. Indeed, you need large number of Ns of the same type, or large number of N daggers of the same type to be applied to the ground state to construct a coherent state. Are there other questions? Okay, but of course not all is lost, because while this is saying that it doesn't have a classical limit in the usual sense, that we cannot have a classical field configuration, okay, constructed as some limit of a quantum state, okay, in this fermionic field theory. As a quantum theory, it makes perfect sense, because you might have heard about spin system, right, which has only two states. Hilbert space is two-dimensional. That system has no problem as a quantum theory. It just doesn't come from quantizing a classical theory in the sense of by replacing Poisson brackets by commutator brackets. But as a quantum theory, it makes perfect sense, and that is also the case for the fermionic theory. Okay, that this system that I have described here, okay, based on these anti-commutation relations over here, makes perfect sense as a quantum theory. Okay, and we will indeed see that this reproduces the algebra that we want for describing a system of identical fermions. So, for example, the Heisenberg's equation remains the same. Okay, if you think of psi as an operator, then IH bar del psi del t will be given by minus the commutator of H hat with psi. See here, there is no anti-commutator. So this is the standard Heisenberg equation of quantum mechanics, and that still holds. What breaks down, what doesn't hold, is the path that we normally follow for quantizing a classical system, which is what I have done here. But if you regard this as a quantum system that I have defined, then there is no problem, right? This is a perfectly good quantum theory. And this is something you should keep in mind while dealing with fermions. Are there questions or comments?
Sir?
Go ahead, please.
What is the notion of wave function psi tr in case of Heisenberg picture?
See, now you have to think of this as an operator, right? This is not a wave function. In the Heisenberg pictures,
Okay.
it's actually a field operator, right? So this is playing the role of X and P that play in quantum mechanics. Right? So don't think of psi as a wave function anymore, right?
Okay, sir.
Okay, so let me then see the consequence of Heisenberg equation. So here I have written down the anti-commutation relation again, right? Psi with pi anti-commutator is IH bar times the Dirac delta function. And now if you use this relation that pi is IH bar psi dagger, which is also what we derived. Let me remind you here. The quantum version of this is pi is IH bar psi dagger. Then we get the relation that the anti-commutator between psi and psi dagger gives you delta q bar minus r prime. And you also have the anti-commutator between psi and psi 0, anti-commutator between psi dagger and psi dagger 0. And the Hamiltonian is given in terms of psi and psi dagger by this formula. These are all we derived earlier. With this, let's now try to see what the Heisenberg equations of motion give. So the anti-commutator between H hat and psi, the commutator between H hat and psi, because that's what we need here. We can write in this point. So this is the, look at the minus sign, right? This is the usual commutator. So now we expand out H hat by using this, okay, to write it this way. And this is the non-trivial step, that what you have done here is that I have used the fact that psi of tr prime anti-commutes with psi of tr. Okay, so I could bring psi to the left of this psi of tr prime to the left of psi tr by picking up a minus sign, which is here. And then because H hat is a differential operator that can involve derivatives with respect to r, but not with respect to r prime, we can pass psi tr prime to H hat as well, right? They commute. So using this, I have written this as minus psi tr dagger, psi tr prime, brought it all the way here, and H hat times psi tr. And this part I have written kept as it is. And now I use the anti-commutator between this. See, now you see that H hat times psi tr has gone to the right in both equations. And what we are left with is the anti-commutator between psi and psi dagger. This is psi tr prime, psi tr dagger, and this is psi tr dagger, psi tr prime. Both have minus sign. So that gives you a minus of a Dirac delta function times H hat psi tr, and that gives you back this. So here H hat prime is just a differential operator, H hat, but r is replaced by r prime. Okay, so if H hat has derivative with respect to r or components of r, H hat prime will have derivative with respect to components of r prime. Okay, and that's because of this Dirac delta function. So using this, we can now write down the Heisenberg equation. So IH bar del psi del t is minus H hat commutator with psi, which we just computed, and that gives you H hat prime times psi. And this, of course, is a correct equation. Okay, this is the Schrodinger equation that we started with. This is a classical field equation that we started with. and you wanted a quantum theory with that equation, right? That's the part that is preserved. Okay? That has not gotten lost because of replacing commutator brackets by anti-commutators. So Ehrenfest's theorem still holds. Okay, so that means that if you take the expectation value of the equations of motion of the Heisenberg equation, you recover the classical equations of motion. Okay, so let me remind you, classical equation of motion. I didn't write the classical equation of motion. Classical equation of motion is basically this, right? IH for del psi del t minus h at psi equals 0. And that's exactly what you have gotten back here. Are there questions?
Yeah, so hello.
Yes, go ahead.
In the bosonic case, once we stipulate that while quantizing that the commutator is some delta function, we can also at least mathematically write down some uncertainty relations between A and A dagger.
Yes.
That we cannot do in the fermionic case. Like,
yeah, at least the standard derivation breaks out.
Yeah, so like, will we have, I mean, it might not be relevant, but will we have some sort of an Heisenberg uncertainty relation here then?
Yeah, I would think so, that you cannot, okay, I mean, you can try to work this out, whether you can find simultaneous eigenfunctions of A and A dagger. Okay. See, if the commutator is non-zero, right? Then
Yeah.
you cannot have simultaneous eigenfunctions of A and A dagger. Right? Because if they did, then the commutator would vanish of A and A dagger. Okay, see here, I mean, it's even hard to imagine what will be the eigenvalue of, what will be the meaning of eigenvalues of A and A dagger, because as we saw, right, we wrote down the matrix representations of A and A dagger, right?
Yeah.
And those matrix representations are non-diagonal. Okay? So you could start with A plus A dagger and maybe 1 over I times A minus A dagger, which are Hermitian, and see if one can construct simultaneous eigenvalues of those. I have a feeling that they will, it will not be possible. See, in this case, the point is A and A dagger, the algebra is finite dimensional algebra, right? It's a basically 2 by 2 matrix algebra.
Yeah.
Because for each n, you can do things separately. And you can check if it is possible to write down a state that is simultaneous eigenvalues of A and A dagger.
Okay.
It probably will not happen.
All right.
Ashok?
Yes. Go ahead.
So when we have the Robertson uncertainty relation, there is an anti-commutator on the RHS also, which we neglect, right? In this, when we, so I think even if the anti-commutator is non-zero, we will get an uncertainty relation.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. So you can just go through the derivation carefully and check. But in this case, the point is, normally the uncertainty principle is used to put as a limit of how much classical you can get. Here you can never get anywhere close to classical. Okay, so in that sense, I mean, things are always uncertain. Okay, because the variance cannot be made small compared to the mean.
Also, one thing, another thing, like, also one measure of classical limit is when we take h cross to 0 in some equations, like in the path integral formulation, we can sort of recover some classical probabilities.
Yes.
Can we do that for fermionic system, for a system like this?
No, that's the point. In the h bar goes to 0 limit, right? You don't have a class. See, normally what happens in the h bar goes to 0 limit is that you reduce the uncertainty to arbitrarily small values, right?
Yeah.
That you cannot do here, right? Because reducing uncertainty means what? That somehow the variance is small compared to mean, right? So you can, if you start with something like coherent state, then this statement that the variances are small compared to mean, right? This smallness is in the h bar. That it becomes really 0 when h bar goes to 0.
Yeah.
that kind of classical state doesn't even exist in the formula.
So analogously, we cannot write an action for this system.
No, you cannot write an action for this system because psi anti-commutes. Okay, strictly speaking, there's no classical action. See, this is not a number, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it was a number, then psi and psi dagger, right? How can they not commute, right? Or psi and two psis, how can they not commute? So this is a formal action that one writes down. You write this action to derive the rules for quantization, but that's about it, right? You shouldn't think of this action as something what you normally think of as an action, which should give a number, right, for a given field configuration.
Yeah. So if we use this for the path integral approach, we'll only get the bosonic theory. We
Well,
won't.
see, I mean, there is a way to get formal path integral even in fermionic theory, but then you have to change the definition of integral itself. So that I think you will see only in the quantum mechanics 2 or quantum field theory 2 when you do path integral approach. So there is a formal way to make sense of path integral approach even for fermions, but those will not be integrals for conventional numbers.
So the action won't be of significance there.
It will be, but again in a formal sense.
Okay.
Okay. The action will not be a number. Okay, unlike in this case. Unlike in the bosonic case, right, where the action is just a number for a given field configuration, right? After all, integrals, right? So the integral generates a number. That will not be the case for fermions.
Okay.
Are there other questions? Okay, so let me then proceed. So let's just quickly demonstrate that we recovered the algebra of A and N dagger, because this is what we started, right? We said that we want to reproduce the algebra of A and N dagger from a quantum field theory. And we do have a quantum field theory, even though it doesn't have a classical limit in the conventional sense. So we define A and N dagger via the expansion of psi and psi dagger. This is identical to what we had for bosons. And you can also invert this. This doesn't depend on whether the ends commute or anti-commute. So you can invert this to write AM in terms of psi and AM dagger in terms of psi. This is just by using orthonormality of the U's. And from this, you can calculate the AM dagger anti-commutator. So just use these expressions. And that reduces to computing the psi dagger anti-commutator, because this is given in terms of psi, this is given in terms of psi dagger. And using the fact that this is the Dirac delta function, we get back delta Mn. Okay, so once it's Dirac delta function, the arguments R and R prime become the same, and we get back delta Mn. So this reproduces the first anti-commutator that we need, that AM N dagger anti-commutator is delta Mn. Similarly, if you take the psi AM N anti-commutator, right, then it will be similar, except that the psi will be replaced by psi dagger will be replaced by psi, and that's of course 0. So AM N anti-commutator will be 0, AM dagger N dagger anti-commutator will be 0. So these are exactly what we wanted for describing multi-fermion states, multiple identical fermions. And similarly, the Hamiltonian, when you substitute psi and psi dagger in terms of A's and A daggers, okay, as before, the A's can be passed through H hat, okay, because H hat is a differential operator in R. A's of course don't depend on R. So once you substitute for psi using this, we can bring it to this form, and then use the fact that H hat on UN is En on UN. This integral gives you delta Mn. So that's what I've written here, and that gives us back sum over n En dagger n. So this of course is identical to what we did for bosons. Here the only difference is that you have replaced bosonic, the commutators, by anti-commutators everywhere, but the manipulations are exactly the same. Okay, there is really no difference in how we manipulate. So are there any questions? And you can also in principle construct the number operator. which is a n dagger n, which counts how many particles there are, irrespective of what kind of particles you have. So this just counts acting on a state, it counts how many n daggers you have applied on the vacuum. And that you can show comes simply from integrating the density. And again, you see that as far as this part is concerned, it's similar to bosons. Namely, to get the number operator, you take the usual density, right? Psi dagger psi in quantum mechanics measures density. So use the formula for density, regard this as an operator, and then integrate over R to calculate the total number. So this number would have been 1 for single particle state. Now it has become an operator and it counts the number of particles. Any questions so far? Okay, so we can also work out the map of other operators. Okay, again, the situation here is very similar to what we had for the bosonic theory. So for one body operator, in fact, there is no difference. So one body operators in the first description, right, where you think of this as a system of multiple particles, is given by the sum over single body operators b hat I. Okay, this acts on one particle at a time. So this depends only on the Ri and derivatives with respect to Ri. This we know is mapped to this operator in the second description. This you have already seen, where B and P is given by this matrix element. And now all you have to do is that you have to substitute the expression for B and P, okay, which is given here. So to construct B hat, this operator, same operator, and rewrite this in terms of psi and psi dagger. Okay, so what you can do is that we can bring A n dagger here. Because again, this is a differential operator, has nothing to do with A n dagger. So you can bring A n dagger to this side. That gives you psi. Sorry, this should have, yeah. So psi dagger R1. Okay, that you can see here, and then UP times AP gives sum over P gives you psi. Okay, so the single body operators are mapped to this combination over here. So this is again the same as what we had for bosons. Is this clear to everybody? Any question? Okay, so for two body operator, there is slight difference. Okay, but that difference actually already arose last time in the last lecture. So let me explain this. So the two body operator acting on the n particle system is given by this. This is in the first description as a system of many particles. This we have seen is mapped to this operator V hat over here. And the main difference in the bosonic case is that now you have to be careful about ordering the A's, right? Which you didn't have to worry about for the bosons because they commuted. Right? Now whether you use AQ, AP or AP, AQ will make a difference in sign, and similarly for these. And the rule that we had found, okay, well, which I had left as an exercise for you to check, is that VMN PQ is accompanied by AM dagger, AN dagger, but here its AQ comes first and then A, where VMN PQ is defined by this matrix element over here. And now when you substitute this, okay, just use this VMN PQ and substitute here. And then move the A's and A daggers around. What you find is that you have psi dagger R1, psi dagger R2, then this operator V hat 1, 2, and then R2 comes first. So you have psi TR2 and then psi TR1, and that's because the P comes before Q, and you see that P is accompanied with yes, P has argument R1. So because sorry, I made a mistake. Okay, so here okay, Q comes before P. Okay. Q is accompanied by UQ. Right? This is contracted. This is multiplied by UQ, and that has argument R2. And that's the reason why psi of TR2 comes before psi of TR1. Is this point clear? Otherwise, there is no difference between bosons and fermions, right? This manipulation is exactly identical to what we did for bosons. So if there are no questions, we are going to move to a new subject now. So if there are questions on this, please ask. Or anything about quantization of fermions.
Like we chose a particular kind of algebra anti-commutator. Like could you have chosen different kind of algebra and different kind of statistics could have be derived?
Yeah, we could. In fact, in 1+1 dimension, people have explored various different kinds of statistics. Right? Here, for example, the square of AP is 0, right? The square of A is 0, right? And square of A in dagger for any n is 0. But people have tried to construct algebras where instead of the square being 0, some kth power is 0. Yes, or for some fixed k.
Yes, yes.
Instead of for fermions, you can put a single state in single particle in one state, right? You cannot put more than one particle. So for these strange statistics called parafermionic statistics, you can put k particles in one state or k minus 1 particle in one state, but not more than that, because kth power of a dagger is 0. Indeed, people have tried this, right? And these kinds of particles you can consider in 1+1 dimension, but once you go beyond 1+1, this is not possible. And that's because once you have, say, once the R1 R2 exchange can be done continuously, you can show that you can only pick up minus sign or plus sign under exchanges, and that forces you to have either fermionic statistics or bosonic statistics.
Okay.
So we'll be sticking to those fermions and bosons. Any other question?
Sir, can you make sense electron as a classical particle? Like even if I suppose we don't have a field like classical field theory, can we think electron as a classical particle?
Well, I think a single electron will be hard to think as a classical particle. Okay. Maybe in some appropriate limit, a collection of electrons in a large charge of body, of course, can be thought of as a classical particle.
Okay, okay.
But a single electron, okay, you have to see whether you can, I mean, so you have to be able to put the electron in a wave function, right, for which the momentum is large compared to its uncertainty, and the position is also large compared to its uncertainty, right? It is probably possible. And in that case, to that kind of wave function, you can think of as a classical electron system, classical electron state. It's
Okay.
Gaussian, right? To think of this free particle, like non-negative, is a Gaussian wave packet, but with a phase, right, which also gives you a momentum. If you just take normal Gaussian in position, right, without a phase, then that average momentum is 0.
Right.
But if you have e to the minus ax squared plus I px, okay, for some constant p, then
Right.
describes a particle which also carries momentum. And in the momentum space, it is also Gaussian. So now you can try to take the p to be large and x to be large and try to construct something like a classical point particle moving in space.
Okay.
But electron field you cannot certainly think of as a classical field.
Yes, yes.
The electron is formula. Is this point clear? Okay, so this distinction that I made, right, between classical limit, okay, this is at the level of field theory. Okay, at the level of field theory, fermions are different from bosons because bosons are described by a classical field theory. It has a well-defined classical limit. For fermions, there is a well-defined classical limit for fermionic field. But if you take a single particle, at the level of single particle, there is no difference between bosons and fermions. Okay? So if you have a fermionic and a harmonic oscillator, a single fermion and a harmonic oscillator, right? There is no distinction. I mean, you don't really know whether it's a fermion or a boson till you bring another particle. So there, whatever you could do for bosons, you can do for fermions. You can construct coherent states for bosons and coherent states for fermions. So these two should be distinguished. That what is not possible for a fermion is to write down a field theory whose classical limit is a regular quantum, a regular classical field theory. Any other question? Okay, so then we will proceed to the next topic. So now we are going to start discussing relativistic particles. Okay, and in fact, in the rest of the course, we will be devoted towards relativistic particles. Okay, our quantization of relativistic particles and relativistic fields. So from now on, we are going to work in units where we set h bar equal to 1 and the speed of light equal to 1. But of course, in any formula, we can always recover powers of h bar and c using dimensional analysis. So using in these units, right? Suppose you get an equation like A equal to B. You should keep in mind that the actual form of the equation is not A equal to B, but A equal to some power of h bar times some power of c times B. And these parts, right, A and B, we can get by simply comparing the dimensions of the two sides. Okay, you calculate the dimension of A, calculate the dimension of B. If they match, then A and B must be 0. If they don't match, then just adjust the A and B in such a way that the dimensions on the two sides match. And that will determine A and B unity. So in a sense, you are not really losing out anything by setting h bar and c equal to 1 from the beginning. It just makes writing the various formulae easier. So even though it requires that at the end you have to do a little more work using dimensional analysis. So in these units, the relation between energy and momentum that we normally see in special relativity, which is E equal to square root of P square C square plus M square C to the 4. This takes this more compact form, it's just P square plus M square, right? Because C you have set equal to 1. Is this okay? Are there questions on this? Okay, so let me proceed. So the question that we'll be interested in is, what is the generalization of the free particle Schrodinger equation? Okay. So for this, we have to recall the original motivation that led to Schrodinger equation. Okay, so what was that? So this is the Schrodinger equation. And the way we motivated ourselves at the beginning of quantum mechanics, why the wave function should satisfy an equation like this, is that plane waves of the form e to the minus I plus I p dot r should satisfy Schrodinger equation when the non-relativistic relation between E and P holds. And indeed, if you substitute this here, the left hand side gives you back E times psi, and the right hand side gives you P square by 2, right? Because each derivative brings a factor of I times P. So square two derivatives gives you I P square, and that's P square by 2. So we recovered the usual relation between energy and momentum from the Schrodinger equation by applying it on plane waves. But now you want something else. We want a relation of this kind. And this looks like a simple generalization of this. After all, there is just a square root, P square plus M square. And indeed, in the small p limit, it reproduces this, right? Because in the small p limit, if you expand, you get the S plus M plus P square by 2M and then higher order terms. But when you want to translate this to an equation of this kind, then we start seeing the difficulty in doing this. And that's because if we have any differential operator, suppose you are looking for an equation like I del psi del t is equal to some differential operator acting on psi. A differential operator with a finite number of derivatives is going to produce a polynomial in momentum on the other side, right? Because each derivative brings down a factor of p when you act on this to the IP dot. So any differential equation where the left hand side is just I del t, right hand side involves complicated derivatives with respect to space coordinates. Any differential operator of this kind will give on the right hand side a polynomial in derivatives or polynomial in momentum but not something like square root of p square plus m square. And this shows that simple modification of the right hand side of the Schrodinger equation is not going to work. Are there questions on this? So if not, let me proceed. So one route to solving this problem is a Dirac equation. And this, here we make the wave function multi-component. We'll eventually return to Dirac equation, but later in this course. But let me just mention at this time that I'll assume that you are familiar with Dirac equation as just for relativistic quantum mechanics, not as a quantum field theory. So I'll assume that you know Dirac equation and proceed from there. So if you haven't studied, please study Dirac equation at some time between now and when I start discussing formulas, okay, in the context of relativistic quantum field theory. But there is an apparently simpler route, okay, and that's what we will try to follow at least for now. And that is to square the relation between E and P. So instead of writing this as E equal to square root of P square plus M square, we can write this as E square equal to P square plus M square. And then there is a simple equation from which it follows. If we take an equation like this, then you can see if you substitute a plane wave, a second derivative in time will bring down minus IE squared, right? That's minus E squared. So on the left hand side, it gives you E squared times phi. This we have already seen brings down minus P squared, so that gives you P squared phi and M squared phi. So we get back E square equal to P square plus M square. So this equation is called the Klein-Gordon equation. And the next few lectures we'll spend trying to understand how to make a quantum theory out of this. Are there questions? Okay, so let me now point out some features of the Klein-Gordon equation. The first feature is that this equation has second order time derivative. Unlike Schrodinger equation, which was here, it has first order time derivative. Klein-Gordon equation has second order time derivative. And that means that if you want to set up an initial value problem, that suppose you want to give the field configuration initially and then start evolving from there, we need to specify both phi and phi dot initially, and then that will determine phi at a later time. Because once phi and phi dot are given, then we can use this differential equation to evolve forward or backward in time. The second point I want to emphasize is that the equation is real. And there is no I anywhere here. And that's different from what happens for the Schrodinger equation, right? There's an I over here. So what one means by this equation, what the significance of this equation being real is that if the initial phi and phi dot are real, then phi will remain real. So another way of saying this, that if we write phi as the real part plus I times the imaginary part, and then substitute it in this equation, then by comparing the real parts and imaginary parts on both sides, we see that phi r and phi I will individually satisfy Klein-Gordon equation, and they will have independent evolution, right? If we know, give the initial value of phi r and phi r dot, we know phi r at a later time. Independently of this, if you know the initial value of phi I and phi I dot, we will know phi I at a later time. So you can really think of this as two real fields, which are independent of each other. And so for this reason, we might as well work with real phi. Right? If we want to deal with later on with a complex phi, we can always think of this as a two real fields and proceed. Okay, so we need to understand the case of real phi. Are there questions on this? Is it clear? Now, these two facts together tell us that the Klein-Gordon equation effectively has the same number of degrees of freedom as the Schrodinger equation. So what are degrees of freedom? Okay, roughly you can think of degrees of freedom as the number of classical solutions, independent classical solutions. Or equivalently, we can think of degrees of freedom as the number of initial conditions that you have to specify to determine the classical solution completely. So for Klein-Gordon equation, you have to specify phi and phi dot. So two real functions of R, right, initially. For the Schrodinger case, there is only one field, and its first order derivatives, you only have to specify psi, right, initially. So one function, but it's a complex function, right? Because this equation is complex, we have to specify psi, not only the real part of psi, but also the imaginary part of psi. That determines psi everywhere at record time. So you still have to specify two real functions. So from that perspective, we can see that the Klein-Gordon equation and the Schrodinger equation both have the same number of degrees of freedom, in the sense that they have that you need two initial functions to determine solutions to the equations of motion. And this will also show up in the quantum theory. We'll see that just like the Schrodinger field, when you second quantize, you have one kind of particle maybe in different quantum states. Okay. Similarly, when you take Klein-Gordon equation and quantize it, we'll have one kind of particle in different quantum states, different energy eigenstates. Okay, but this will of course come later. Any questions? Okay, so now we are going to come to the third point, okay, which is more subtle. Here you see that now if we substitute the plane wave, right, e to the minus I et plus I p dot r in the Klein-Gordon equation, you get E squared times phi on this side, you get E squared times phi plus m squared times phi. So you get E squared equal to P squared plus m squared. And it has the usual solution that you want, E equal to square root of P square plus m square. But it also has another solution, which is E equal to minus square root of P square plus m square.
Sir?
Yes, go ahead please.
I have a doubt in second point, sir.
Yes.
In that second point, we said that pi is real.
Yes.
And in the next line, we wrote pi is equal to pi r plus I into pi I. So in that sense, pi becomes imaginary, sir?
Oh, okay, let me say. So let me say this second part. So I said the equation is real, right? This equation is real. So
Yes,
if
sir.
you take initial phi and phi dot to be real, then phi will remain real. Okay?
Okay, sir.
But suppose we don't do that. We allow phi to be complex.
Okay, sir.
Then we can decompose this equation into two separate equations.
Okay,
So
sir.
you should think of this as an independent statement than this, right? Here you are saying that if we set initial conditions to be real, then phi will remain real. Now you are saying, let's suppose that if phi is complex, okay, where phi is a phi r plus I phi I, then the equation for phi r and phi I decouple, right? Phi r equation is independent of phi r and phi I equation is independent of phi r.
Yes.
So it's as if you have two independent scalar, real fields.
Okay, sir.
And that's the reason why you are saying that we can take phi to be real, because if you have a complex field, if you ever have to deal with complex fields, right, which you do have to deal with sometimes, we can just think of this as two real fields. Okay, because there is no equations on mix.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Is this point clear?
Clear, sir. Clear.
Okay. So here we see that we have two solutions, right? A negative energy solution, which we don't want, because if we really allow negative energy solutions, right, then that means that we can have a particle carrying unbounded energy that is unbounded from below, right? Because P can be as large as you want, and so E can be as low as you want, as much negative as you want. And certainly that's not very consistent scenario. But if we start with Klein-Gordon equation, we have to live with it. And this is the point I am to elaborate more, right? In what sense you have to live with it.
Excuse me, sir. Could I ask a question? So when you say we don't want negative energy solution, but does it matter what value does the energy have? Because what we will measure will be only the change in energies.
Yes, that is true, right? But because the energy is unbounded from below, right? You can have a negative energy particle and a positive energy particle, and the difference, right? That difference can become unbounded.
Okay, sir.
Right? Is this clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you can create, say, when you go to multi-particle state, right? Suppose you are trying to do quantization of this as a multi-particle, as you did for multi-particle Schrodinger equation, right? Then if you really have negative energy particles, you have n negative energy particles, right?
Yes, sir.
The energy will be minus n times this, right?
Yes, sir.
More particles you add, the lower will be energy.
Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
That's
Okay.
not acceptable similarity.
Yeah. Okay. Clear, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So let me say what the issues are. That the point is that if we start with now one can say that okay, suppose there are negative energy solutions, but why don't we just throw them away? We accept only the positive energy solutions and throw away the negative energy solutions. What prevents us from doing that? What prevents us from doing that is that if we start with a generic initial condition, and then you express the solution as a superposition of plane waves, then typically both solutions will appear. And the easiest way to see this is here. So let's do a Fourier decomposition of phi, right, which you can always do in R, right? So phi TR, we write a Fourier in the Fourier expansion. AP times e to the IP dot R, and now we know that the T dependence by equations of motion will be of the form e to the minus IT times P square plus M square. And then there is another solution that we can add BP with same e to the IP dot R, but now with IT times square root of P square plus M square. So this is the most general solution that you can write down, right? Arbitrary superposition of the plane waves, okay, of these. Now, if we want to find,
hello, sir. So why we are not taking the Fourier transform in 4-dimensional space? I mean D4P.
Okay, because the solution, okay, maybe don't think of this as a Fourier transform. Okay, let's think of this as we are constructing the general solution by superposing plane waves. So this is a particular solution, right? With E given by either square root of P square plus M square or square root of minus square root of P square plus M square. So a general solution will be an arbitrary superposition of these, and the coefficients are functions of P vector only, right? Because P is not independent, right? E is either square root of P square plus M square or minus square root of P square plus M square. So a most general solution can be written in this form. Is this point clear?
Yes. So you want to say that E is also related to P, that's why.
Exactly, because equations of motion relate, right? E to P.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is the most general solution. But now, once we demand that phi is real, then you see, take phi star, right? What will happen? If you take phi star, what happens? A gets complex conjugated, this becomes plus IT, and this becomes minus. But we want phi star to be phi, right? How can phi star be equal to phi? It has become minus here, and it has become plus here. Well, phi has this also, right? So if we set A star equal to B, that will almost work because that will compensate for this fact that this has become plus. But this minus sign over here has to be compensated by changing the sign, sign of T in the argument, right? Because since this is integrated over, right, I can always write the integral dqp B of minus P comes into the minus IP dot R. In that case, once you demand that AP star is equal to B minus P or BP star is equal to A minus P, then this phi will be real. Is this clear? So because of this, we see that you cannot simply set B equal to 0. Okay, we cannot just declare that we will keep only the positive energy solutions, okay, only these solutions, and throw away the negative energy solutions, because then you will not be able to get a real phi. Okay, we have to satisfy this relation. Okay, so this is what I have said again here. Now, given this, you can say that then why don't we go back to our to complex phi? If this is the problem, that you cannot set B to be 0, why not allow complex phi and set B equal to 0? That, of course, is an acceptable solution. Phi TR is given by just the superposition of A of B. But now what happens is that the initial condition that leads to such solutions will have to involve long range correlation between phi and phi dot. So let me explain this. So now phi is real, phi is complex, phi dot is also complex. Phi is given by this, and phi dot is derivative with respect to time, right? So you can take the derivative with respect to time. That will be given by integral dq derivative with respect to time will bring down the factor of minus I times square root of t square plus m square and times this. And now we want to see how to set initial condition at t equal to t naught. Now we see that because of these two relations, we can determine A of p just from phi tr, right? By inverse Fourier transform. Here it is. We can determine A of p from phi tr. So we don't have to specify phi dot initially. But it's a second order differential equation, so we should specify phi dot. It's just that phi dot cannot be specified independently of phi. But what phi dot should be, we can calculate by simply taking this expression for A of p over here and substituting that. So phi dot is not independent of phi, it's given in terms of phi. But what's more important is that because of this square root, phi dot will depend on phi at different values of r prime, when r prime is far away from r. Okay, so this should be clear, because that's it. So here is A of p, right? We substitute it here. So you see that phi dot tr is determined in terms of phi of t naught r prime. That, of course, phi dot t naught r is determined on phi of t naught r. So the initial conditions are not independent, but it depends on phi of t naught r prime for all values of r prime, not just those close to r. And this is what we can call non-local initial condition, because you have to specify phi dot at some point r in terms of phi at all values of r, or all values of r. Okay, even if it's 100 million years away, we may have to specify that value of phi there, 100 million light years away. Okay, we have to specify the value of phi there to determine what phi dot is. So this is what we call non-local initial condition, the long range correlation. Now for free particles, one could still live with it. Okay, one will say, okay, it's non-local, but let's live with it and just work with positive energy solutions. But in this formalism, it becomes difficult to construct interacting theories without introducing the notion of action at a distance. Because if you try to construct interacting theories out of this, you will find that you introduce the action at a distance, where two particles can interact instantaneously, even if they are far separated in space. And that, of course, is inconsistent with the basic postulate of special relativity. So for this reason, we will proceed by taking phi to be real and keeping both solutions. Is this clear? Any questions or comments?
Sir, another thing,
Yes.
that when we construct our Hilbert space,
Yes.
using the eigen solutions,
Yes.
we also demand things like completeness and all. I mean, those things are like for granted taken. But if we throw away the solutions,
Yes.
half of the solutions, like we won't have that anymore, would we?
Yeah, you can define. See, that's the question of this non-local condition, that you can define the Hilbert space to be those that you get by linear combination of the positive energy solutions, right? Just by definition.
And the equation will still ensure that positive energy solutions remain positive energy solution.
Yes, that it will. I mean, again, in a field theory, right? Once you start introducing interactions, things start mixing. But in a field theory, right, because positive energy solutions are exact solutions, right? They'll of course remain positive energy. But typically, a local interaction will always mix positive and negative energy.
So in a free field theory, we could form a complete set of eigen bases for the Hilbert space just by considering the positive energy solutions.
By, yeah, meaning that's the definition, right? So suppose I give you the basis of states, okay, where we have only positive energy solutions. And we say that only those states are allowed which are linear combinations of these solutions.
Okay.
Say generic phi TR cannot be expanded in terms of positive energy solutions, right? So you can think of this just in terms of classical mechanics, right? Because after all, you build the Hilbert space from quantization of the phase space. Just think of it in terms of classical mechanics, right? What this is saying is that even though it's a second order differential equation, we cannot specify independently the initial condition on phi and phi dot.
Yes.
We have cut down the phase space by half. And the way we cut down is highly non-local. Okay, we specify phi dot initially in terms of phi, but that relation between phi dot and phi involves long range correlation, right? Phi dot at a given point will be determined by phi at all other points. But if we declare that those are the only classical solutions that we'll consider, whose analog in the Hilbert space will be that we only consider these particular class of states and allow only linear combination of these states to be the states of the system, of the theory. Then nobody can complain, right?
Yes.
Because you have defined your Hilbert space as just spanned by those states. Okay, the positive energy solutions.
Provided that the positive energy solution, then linear combination is also positive energy solution.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you.
Because it will be linear combination of positive energy solutions, right?
Yes.
Okay, and the time evolution, because these are exact solutions, right? Time evolution will not change positive energy to negative energy till you perturb it, till you switch on some interaction. Any other question? Okay, so then what we are going to do is to proceed by taking phi to be real and keeping both solutions. But this, of course, leads to the question back that what is the interpretation of the negative energy solutions? Okay, that if we take phi to be real and keep both solutions, because as you saw, that negative energy solution will give you, will basically tell us that the energy is unbounded from below. Okay, particularly when you go to multi-particle states, because you can keep adding particles of negative energy, and there's a limit to how many, to how low you can get in terms of energy. So it turns out that it's difficult to find an interpretation of this negative energy solution in the first quantized formulation. So as a first quantized theory of multi-particle states, multi-particle relativistic particles, okay, it doesn't really work. Okay, so the Klein-Gordon equation, while it's a nice generalization of the Schrodinger equation, which looks relativistically invariant, but it's not possible to give a fully consistent quantum interpretation as a first quantized theory, where you think of phi as a wave function of a particle and say try to build multi-particle system from there. However, it will turn out that we get a perfectly consistent interpretation of the second quantized formulation when we regard phi as a quantum field describing a system of bosons. And this is what we'll try to do now. Are there questions? Okay, so let me now then turn to quantization of the Klein-Gordon equation. So I'll probably only do the step 1 today, which is to write down the Lagrangian. So recall that what is the step 1 of quantization of any field theory, that you have to first write down a Lagrangian from which you can derive the equation that you want to quantize. Because once you have the Lagrangian, you can construct the Hamiltonian from there. Okay, and then proceed. And also you can define the canonically conjugate momenta, and then you proceed to quantize. And this time, because you are thinking of the phi's as describing boson, identical bosons, will not have any problem of anti-commutators. It will be the standard quantization. So here is the claim. So the claim is that this is the Lagrangian which produces Klein-Gordon equation. So here I have used a shorthand notation. This just means the derivative of partial derivative of phi with respect to t. So you can derive the equations of motion from here in two ways: either just use directly Euler-Lagrange equation, or by using action principle. So let me show how to derive it using action principle. So the action is given by the integral of the Lagrangian, then which is here. But this part inside the square bracket is often called the Lagrangian density. This is the Lagrangian after integrating over the space part, and when you after integrate over time part, that's the action. So now to find the equations of motion from here, we have to make arbitrary variation of phi, which we'll call delta phi, and demand that the action, the variation of the action vanishes. Right? The first order variation of the action vanishes, and that's the principle of extremization. So what is delta S? First of all, you see that since each of these are squares, when you compute delta S, the half will go away. So you'll get derivative of delta phi times the derivative with respect to derivative of phi with respect to time. Then the second term will give you gradient of delta phi times gradient of phi, and then the last term will give you m square times delta phi times phi. Is this clear? Any question at this stage? So now we are going to manipulate this as follows. So in the first term, we integrate by parts in time, and in doing so, we'll ignore the boundary terms, because at initial and final time, delta phi vanishes. Okay, so you can write as a delta minus delta phi times second derivative of phi with respect to time. So that's this term. In the second term, we integrate by parts in x, y, and z to move this gradient onto this. And here again there are boundary terms, but this time the boundary terms are at spatial infinity. And we ignore these boundary terms by requiring that phi vanishes at spatial infinity. And indeed we will see that if we want a finite energy system, then that is a requirement. So when you write down the expression for the Hamiltonian, we will see that it involves the integral of phi square, an integral of m square phi square. So unless phi vanishes at infinity, it will not vanish. So you can think of this as a boundary condition on phi, that it starts to vanish at spatial infinity. Or you can just put the whole system in a periodic box. Right? This, instead of thinking of this as a integral over unbounded space, right? We can put it in a box of size L, say, okay? Periodic with periodic boundary condition both along x, y, and z direction, and in which case, of course, the boundary terms will vanish because it will be periodic. So using that, we can move this gradient on the gradient of phi, and that will get the Laplacian on phi. And this term will keep as it is. And now we say that if you require delta S to be 0 for arbitrary variation of phi, we see the delta phi has now come out. We have to set the coefficient of delta phi to be 0, and that gives you minus del t square phi minus grad square phi plus grad square phi minus m square phi equal to 0, and that is indeed the Klein-Gordon. Is this clear? Any question?
No, sir.
Now, one can also derive this from Euler-Lagrange equation. So let me briefly indicate how that is done, and then I'll stop. So the first, so this is the Euler-Lagrange equation, right? In the form of functional derivative. Okay, again, let me remind you that this came from the usual Euler-Lagrange equation by thinking of this as a discrete set of variables, and then by including 1 over W cube in both terms to convert them into functional derivatives. So this delta L delta phi dot, right? Let's see where delta L delta phi dot comes from, right? The phi dot is here. So when you take, say, with respect to, suppose you are taking delta L delta phi dot of r prime, that will generate a delta of r minus r prime, right? Because you have a phi dot of t r whole square over phi dot of, and you are taking derivative with respect to phi dot of t r prime. So that will give you a factor of 2, which will cancel this, and it will give a delta cube of r minus r prime, which after you integrate over d cube r is going to give you back this term, d dt of phi dot of t r prime, that's dt square of phi. It will give you this term with a plus sign. This one, you have to calculate, you have to take a variation of this. Last term is easy. You again get a delta function, which you integrate. It cancels the factor of 2 because you have phi square. And this minus sign over here cancels this minus sign over here to give you a plus sign over here. But there's another dependence of phi, and that's from here. So for this, the way we do this, you write this as grad phi dot grad phi. And then when you take the variation, it's enough to take the variation of 1, right? Because the factor of 2 will cancel this. So what you are going to get is grad phi at r times grad of delta phi of r prime. So you get a gradient of a delta function, gradient of delta cube r minus r prime. And that gradient you will have to integrate by parts to make it gradient square phi. That will change the sign, minus sign to plus sign. But there's a minus sign over here, so that will give a minus sign here. So you could derive this equation directly from Euler-Lagrange equation. You will just get the negative of this, dt square phi minus grad square phi plus m square phi equal to 0. So if it's not clear, I'll request you to just go through this and check that indeed the Euler-Lagrange equation gives you this. But we'll use both Euler-Lagrange as well as the action principle because both are useful in for some reason or the other. Are there questions?
Sir?
Yes, go ahead please.
For example, if we know some quantum mechanical equation for a single particle,
yes,
from that how can we find the Lagrangian density?
Okay, so you have to do it somewhat by trial and error. It's not very hard actually, because what I could have written this action. Okay, we can write that. It's easier to write the action directly, right? I could have written the action as follows. That let's look at the Klein-Gordon equation here. Okay, so let's take everything on one side. Okay, say bring it on the other side. So you have minus d2 phi dt square. Okay, that's second derivative of phi with respect to time, plus grad square phi minus m square phi equal to 0. And then the action you can write down by writing integral d4x, that means dt d cube r, times phi times this equation of motion. if the equation that is relevant, that's relevant is linear, right? Which is always the case for quantum mechanical systems. Right? What you can do, you can take the equation and multiply by the wave function, by the function. And what we'll get is the action that reproduces the equation. So this action that I have written here, okay, I could have written, if I had written this action in a slightly different way, okay, by taking, say, you write this as del t phi, right? And do an integration by parts, then it will become minus phi del t square phi, right? Similarly, here, if you integrate by parts, you get phi grad square phi, and then minus m square phi square. Then you see that this can be written as phi times minus del t square phi plus grad square phi plus m square phi, and that is a Klein-Gordon operator. So that is one way you can try to derive equations of derive the action from the equations of motion.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Is this clear?
Clear, sir.
So I have it here in a more symmetric form, okay? But it's easier to follow the route where you write it as phi times the Klein-Gordon equation, and then you do an integration by parts to write it in this form.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I think I'll stop here. Are there other questions?
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, I have a confusion in a lecture 5, page number 40.
Page number 40. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yes.
Sir, when A and dagger, I think page number 41, A and dagger.
This is page number 41.
I mean, no, sir, no, I think.
A and dagger is.
There will be two. Yeah, this, sir. Sir, when A and dagger, AM dagger apply on a ground state, so, sir, that means the one particle create in a mth state and the one particle create in a nth state. So, sir, I don't understand that just AN dagger and AM dagger apply on a ground state that describe a two particle state. But the one particle in a one particle will be in a mth state and one particle will be in a nth state. Sir, is it right, sir?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so but sir, how can we are saying that describe a two particle state? Matlab, we are saying that totally consider the total number of the particle we are considering.
Yes. So imagine that this is a hydrogen atom, right? Suppose the single particle state that we are considering is hydrogen atom.
Okay.
A hydrogen atom has, say, a ground state and a first excited state. So if you take the side of the ground state, so ground state says A1, right? A1 dagger. You suppose U1 describes the ground state and U2 describes the first excited state. If you apply A1 dagger, A2 dagger, that means you are creating the one hydrogen atom in the ground state and another hydrogen atom in the first excited state.
Okay.
You have two hydrogen atoms.
Okay.
It says that you have two particles.
Okay. Sir, instead of AM dagger, if we apply the psi N dagger and psi M dagger, that means this describe a two particle state in a two delta function. There will be a two delta function.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So if you apply psi dagger of R0 and psi dagger of, say, R0 prime, right? That will mean that you are creating two particles. The first particle is in the position eigenstate R0. And the second particle is in the position eigenstate R0 prime.
Okay, so sir, there will be the product of the delta function. Matlab means there will be the product of the two delta function.
Yes, there will.
If we are talking of.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a two particle wave function, right? So the wave
okay.
will be delta cube of R1 minus R0, delta cube of R2 minus R0 prime, plus the combination, right? Because
okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Sir, could you please suggest the QFT related book for basic understanding or for beginner? Sir, could you please suggest?
Basic and okay, I had actually sent a list of books to the students who are crediting, but I'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sir,
yes.
Sir, I have a confusion from today's lecture, actually, the beginning part where you told that for the bosonic system, we can apply as many A-daggers we want on the ground state, but for fermions, we cannot. So what does this mean? Will you explain this part?
Well, that's because A in dagger square is 0, right?
Yes.
Because of the anti-commutator, right? We have seen that A in dagger, anti-commutator is 0, right?
Yes.
Right here.
Oh. Okay.
Dotted, right? So look at this. So this means if M is equal to N, right? Then this is 2M dagger square.
Yes. Oh, okay.
M dagger, 2M dagger square. Right? So that's
what does it mean? We can apply only one A dagger on 0.
This is what's called Pauli exclusion principle, that you cannot put more than one formula in one state.
Okay.
See, in terms of U, we have seen. Let me go back to multi-particle description. If you look at this U, right, we said that the U's are automatically antisymmetric.
Yes.
I have said it somewhere there. Yeah, see, because U's are antisymmetric in the NIs, right? If any two of the NIs are equal, then the corresponding U vanishes.
Yes.
And so this is what is normally called the Pauli exclusion principle, that you cannot put more than one formula in one state.
Yes.
So when you are using this oscillator description, right, using the A daggers, right, that is reflected in the fact that AM dagger square is 0 because of this relation.
Yes.
If you try to apply a given AM dagger more than once on the back, you get 0.
Okay.
Right? So you cannot put more than one on.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir.
That okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think I have to stop now because next class will start. So I think everybody has agreed. So tomorrow we'll have a class at the same time, 1:30 to 3. Even though tomorrow is a holiday, because we'll try to compensate for yesterday's lost class.